if you have a $3 million estate, and I would argue that just having a home in Sydney now probably means you've got a $3 million estate. The reality is you're going to leave each of those kids $1.5 million or more. That's a sizable chunk of cash.
Yeah.
It can make a material difference to their lifestyle and their kids' lifestyle if it's invested wisely, as opposed to blown very quickly. The difference between teaching your kids to invest well and you investing well yourself is the difference between helping them out to helping them out and giving them a home, and your grandkids never having to worry about money, and you can probably have a charitable foundation.
Welcome to the Teaminvest Wealth Builder podcast, where we help you build smarter wealth and make more confident investment decisions. Welcome to this week's episode of Teaminvest Wealth Builders podcast. This week, we're going to speak on a topic that's quite close to any parent or grandparent's heart, and that is the transfer of wealth between generations. What are you going to leave for the next generation and the next generation and future generations to come? Is your time in this world going to make a huge financial difference to your family? So we have with us today Andrew Coleman. He's going to share with us what we need to think about when we talk about intergenerational wealth and what are the things that you can do to prepare that next generation and set your long-term family up for success. Welcome, Andrew, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So firstly, let's start off with the basics. Is intergenerational wealth transfer important?
Well, I think it depends whether you want it to be important or not. You know, if our job as parents or grandparents is to try and leave the next generation better off, then it matters.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you don't really care about your kids and grandkids, then probably it doesn't matter. But you know, I would argue that probably most parents would fall into the first category, not the latter. And I think it's something that we as society have done incredibly poorly. And I mean that with all of the best intent. But we have, as society, done very little to try and educate people into how they can manage wealth, education, culture across generations, mainly because for the majority of human experience, there were more pressing matters. Where can I get my next bite to eat? Where's the housing going to come from? So the idea of leaving things to kids and grandkids was only, something that mattered to the very ultimate elite of the aristocracy. But of course, that isn't the world today. What's particularly concerning, though, is when you look at some of the statistics around it. So I'll start with some of the negatives, then we can talk the positives. So in terms of some of the negatives, there was some research done by PwC and KPMG about a decade ago now that showed that over 80% of people have not considered any form of how they will manage assets across generations. So that means, what will they do with the family business? What will they do with the family home? What will they do with their estate? Yeah. Fair enough. It's a difficult question to confront, your own mortality. We don't want to do it. But of course, that tends to mean that if we don't have a plan for it, the government will have a plan for it. And that tends to be to the benefit of society as a whole, but perhaps not your children or grandchildren. So that's stat number one. Stat number two is we also have to accept the fact that, particularly in the United States, but it is here too, millennials, Gen Z and Gen Alpha now have worse life expectancy outcomes than their parents. So in fact, in the United States, a millennial has life expectancy 10 years younger on average than their parents, which is a terrifying thought. And the reason for that is predominantly socioeconomic. I mean, the US has got all sorts of other problems around gun laws and things, but the reality is that the biggest single predictor of life expectancy is having money, having shelter, having good nutrition, having access to healthcare, and not having stress. Stress is a huge predictor on whether you're going to live longer or not. It's a big catalyst for medical conditions. And if you are worried about money, it is the largest single cause of stress in your life. And so if what we want to do is leave our kids happy, healthy, then we need to leave them wealthy. Yeah. And that really is something that I think, unfortunately, we haven't considered. And we have a need to consider because I think, the great news is the baby boomer generation is the first one living long enough to have to deal with this problem. The great generation, World War II and earlier, life expectancy was low. Yeah. You didn't tend to live to see grandkids unless you had them very young. You certainly didn't live to see great-grandkids. So, you were out of the family home by the age of 55 because you couldn't live in the family home. You'd done back-breaking labor and you couldn't walk upstairs. So the fact that we now have these problems like housing problems and stress and wealth issues, they're all a good thing in the sense of they're an outcome of the society that has improved, but they're also something we've never spent time considering how to deal with as a society as a whole. And so we actually have to, or we're going to end up with bad outcomes. And we're starting to see that in data going through generations. Now, the good news is that we as humans all have access to three things that compound. And so if we believe that compounding over time is particularly valuable, not only the percentage matters, but the longer you can do it for matters, then there are three things that we can all focus on to try and leave a much, much better position for our children and our grandchildren. And those three things, of course, are our wealth, which we'll talk about today, our culture, what have we taught them, what have we led on in terms of what they believe, what they value, what they care about, and of course, education. Because their education compounds. What you learn over your lifetime, you can share to the next generation and the generation after, and what they learn builds upon both their own successes and mistakes. So really, I think if we want to solve the intergenerational equity problem and the generational wealth problem, we need to look at the wealth, obviously, but we also need to look at the other two elements. What can we pass on culturally in terms of values and ethics and things that we want them to care about? Yep. And that'll be different for each family, because whilst I think there are shared society-wide ones, each family's got its own views. But then another one was education, because there's that lovely old joke that the fastest way to become a millionaire is to start a billionaire and invest it badly. And it's the same thing with the money we leave our kids, right? There is no point trying to leave your child more money if they are ill-equipped to deal with it. The sharks will circle, they'll blow it on poor things, they'll be a target for con artists and others who want to take advantage of them. And in the end, they won't be happier. And that's really the goal. Happy, healthy, wealthy, right?
Absolutely.
So from that point of view, we're, I think, going to talk more today about how much it matters wealth-wise and what we can do with some wealth strategies. But I would argue that the best thing we can do is also the education and the culture at the same time. So maybe we'll do another podcast at some point on that. But certainly it's something we're focused on a lot at Teaminvest now, is how do we bring in kids and grandkids of our members so that we can teach them those views around money and investing that will set them up for protection of their wealth once they inherit it, as well as their ability to grow it going forward.
And I think the way things are set up now, education is so much more accessible. I think about growing up, I'd never even heard of a financial advisor or anything to do with equities or anything like that. And I'd like to say that I'm not that old, but now it's something that's a lot more common and a lot more talked about. But when we're talking about culture, there is so many, I guess we've got that culture, I guess, like you said, where it's the first generation now that are living longer. But have we already set a culture of you just look after yourself in retirement and that's your focus? And I mean, how many caravans do you see with the, spending the kids' inheritance stickers on them?
Yeah, look, and I'd be the first person not to want to begrudge someone enjoying their life savings, right? So from that point of view, I admire and I understand the desire to do all of that. But I think your point is right, which is that we haven't as a society ever had to look at, except at the very most upper echelons of the aristocracy, what's the best way to both live your life in an enjoyable way from the fruits of your labor and leave something that will make a material difference to your kids and grandkids. And we're sort of seeing that. I mean, private schools these days, there was a stat that over half the fees paid at all private schools are now being paid by grandparents. There are attempts to deal with this, but they're ad hoc. No one's really sitting down there and saying, what should I really do to create the best outcome? And probably paying private school fees isn't a bad one. I mean, I didn't go to a private school, but it's the idea of pushing education. That's, there's very few places you could probably invest your money better. Buying the kids a house, look, whether you think you should or shouldn't, again, huge reduction in stress and other impacts. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But we're not really confronting that question of what's the best way to do it, other than it very sort of ad hoc ways. And that is a problem. And it's a problem because the money matters. If you think, as an example, and we'll run through some examples in more detail, but if you have a $3 million estate, and I would argue that just having a home in Sydney now probably means you've got a $3 million estate, Sydney or Melbourne, potentially Brisbane too, let alone any investments you've made, and you've got 2 kids, the reality is you're going to leave each of those kids $1.5 million or more. That's a sizable chunk of cash.
Yeah.
It's a big enough chunk of cash that sharks will circle, and it's a big enough chunk of cash that it can make a material difference to their lifestyle and their kids' lifestyle if it's invested wisely, as opposed to blown very quickly.
Absolutely.
And, we can just run through those numbers. But as a quick example, if you put that $3 million into a term deposit, divided it equally amongst the two kids, after tax, it's about $52,000 a year that each kid is better off for their lifestyle that they can spend, just the interest on that term deposit.
Yeah.
Compared to the average median income across the country of about $120,000, that's a material increase. It's 40% of their living standard.
Nothing to sneeze at.
Exactly. So this matters. Now, obviously, I would argue that putting that into a term deposit is by far one of the worst things you could do, short of giving it to them and telling them go and put it on the dogs. But the point is it's going to have a material impact, whether we want to think about it or not. So we should think about how do we maximize the impact for them.
And I think if we look at it that way, this is where that education comes into play. So why don't we put the education aside at the moment, because let's look at what that value can be and what that impact can be. And then maybe we can circle back to the education piece at the end. So let's run some figures, because that's going to give us the true values, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I don't want to bore everyone with too much detail, so we'll just run 3 scenarios. I think the first is the one we've given, which is you leave them each $1.5 million and it goes into a term deposit and they live off the interest.
Yep.
In which case, as we said, it's $52,500 a year after tax to each kid. That's a material improvement in living standards.
Yep.
Obviously, it declines in real value over time because there's inflation, but it is a material increase in living standards. There's no way of arguing it. So at that point, well done.
Yeah.
The question is, can we do better? So if you just look at two other scenarios that we talked about, prior to starting this podcast, the first is putting it in an index fund, which is on average returned about 8.5% over the last sort of 40 years. But let's use 8 because the maths is easier with 8%.
Yeah.
And anyone listening or watching can follow this at home with a compound interest calculator. So what we said with this scenario is very simply, let's assume it's invested for 20 years, a generation.
Yep.
Obviously, one hopes our children will live a lot more than 20 years beyond us, but keep the math simple.
It's a
generation, at least as a generation is defined statistically of 20 years. So they invest it for a generation in the index. It achieves 8%. Let's ignore the decimal points just to make it easy.
Yeah.
And rather than pulling out $52,500 a year, they pull out $100,000 before tax. So they're left with $70,000 roughly after tax. So about another 40% better. So they were 40% better to begin with. Now they're 40% on that better, 52 to 70,000. Well, what are they left with at the end of 20 years? What are they handing on to their kids? And of course, the maths, when you run it through a compound calculator, and I encourage you to do this at home, works out that they will leave each of their kids, or assume they have 1 kid, 2 kids, divide it, but each of your children will have $2.66 million. In other words, roughly double what you left them. So not only will they have had $70,000 a year after tax to put towards private school fees, to put towards a mortgage, to put towards holidays and education, or be a rainy day fund if something goes wrong health-wise, but they will be able to leave their kids almost as much as you left them in total. So that 3 million divided by 2, they will have roughly 3 million to leave to their kids, 1, 2, 3 kids.
So significantly better than putting it into a term deposit.
Yeah, well, at that point, I call it intergenerational wealth, right? The first one is not intergenerational wealth. It's a case of improved living standards, but the pot of money is declining over time. When you're able to leave your kids an amount of money that they can leave their kids the same amount of money or more, you're now talking intergenerational wealth. That's like the idea of the old estate in a country manor, in England, right? This is something that can be passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah.
And if you have that $3 million that you've divided by 2, and instead of getting 8%, you achieve 15% per annum, which is the bottom of the target range we aim for with our members in our education business. But again, we're just going to use 15% to keep it simple. And you still pull out their $100,000 a year pre-tax, so $70,000 a year for their kid, their lifestyle. Then at the end of that 20 years, the difference is actually marked, because at that point, they're not leaving their next generation $2.66 million, but they're actually leaving a whopping $17.9 million, call it $18 million. And that's not just intergenerational wealth, that's intergenerational wealth. This idea, that's an amount of money that no matter how many kids your kids have had, they're leaving their grandkids with a much bigger pot of money than they could ever have dreamed of. And I think that's the point that we forget often when we're thinking of our children, our grandchildren, is that we tend not to look from a compounding term, not only the percentage that matters, because we tend to look at capital preservation rather than capital accumulation. I'm leaving my kids an amount of money. I want them to have that money. That's the term deposit argument or the index fund argument.
Yeah.
But we forget that what really matters is trying to improve the standards of living across multiple generations. Of course, once you throw in inflation, you get an even bigger impact. across those different examples, and we'll talk about that in a second. But on a pure nominal basis, the difference between teaching your kids to invest well and you investing well yourself is the difference between helping them out. That's $52,500 a year. That's really 2 kids at private school.
Yep.
To helping them out and giving them a home. That's the grandkids inheriting another $3 million to share. And your grandkids never having to worry about money, and you can probably have a charitable foundation. That's the $18 million, right?
Yeah.
So the difference in lifestyle that drives over only a 20-year period
It's huge.
is huge. Make that 40 years or 60 years, the numbers start to look insane. You're leaving $100 million type numbers, but we won't go into that. That's another whole thing, right? But I think the point is that this matters. That's why we're doing these numbers, right? Is to try and show people that not only equipping themselves to manage their wealth more wisely matters to themselves, which is obvious, I think, but it matters to your kids and your grandkids. Because if you can be that grandparent that leaves your kids in a position where they can leave their kids double-digit millions, what have you done for your family? I mean, you've really set them up for life.
Yeah.
Across, 50, 100 years. And that's really should be our goal. I mean, if we care as parents and grandparents, then our goal has got to be to maximize the wealth, not only for ourselves, but for the future generations of our family. And you can only do that with education and investing wisely.
Absolutely. I mean, trying to do what you have just said without the education, it just can't be done.
Yeah, well, you're not going to get 15% by giving it to a financial planner. I mean, I have nothing against financial planners, but that's not their goal, right? I mean, we've talked about this on previous podcasts. Their goal is capital preservation. So they would consider it a job well done that your $1.5 million sits in a term deposit, pays for the school fees for your kids and your grandkids, and in 20 years' time is the same $1.5 million you left. For most financial planners, that's a job well done. They didn't lose it. The school fees got paid. What more did you want? And, for a lot of people, that is what you want, right? I'm not upset with that. But that's not generational wealth. That's just helping out a little bit. That's that idea of sort of you being able to assist in continuing to pay the school fees beyond the grave. So, you're paying them through K to 6, then something happens, you're not there, 7 to 12 gets paid too.
Yeah.
That's not generational wealth, though. That's just helping out. Generational wealth is that idea of being able to leave your kids in a position that they can leave their kids better off as well. And that matters. It really does.
Following the incredible success of our standout event in Sydney earlier this year, we would like to extend a warm invitation for you to attend the Emerging Wealth Winners Conference, Melbourne 2025. This event will be held in the iconic MCG Members Dining Room. We're bringing together a standout lineup of only 7 curated ASX-listed CEOs to present the insights, the knowledge, the shared wisdom, and the strategies that help inform investors making wiser decisions on when and where to invest into. This event is sure to be jam-packed, full of the knowledge and the wisdom that you're seeking, and we encourage you to register at tipgroup.com.au. Check out the events page, and we look forward to seeing you there.
And I think something that really shows that, which you hit on before, was let's account for inflation, because I was really surprised with the numbers once we actually count for inflation over 20 years. So what are the numbers when we add in inflation?
Yeah, well, I mean, the numbers are the same because they're nominal, but it's the purchasing power. What is it worth?
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? So, I mean, look, again, for these examples, you can calculate this at home. This isn't rough, but this isn't too difficult to do. But if you assume a 3% inflation rate for the next 20 years, the problem with that capital preservation is you've paid their school fees, but you've not really left a lot in the kitty, because that $1.5 million in 20 years' time will have an equivalent purchasing power of about $285,000 today. So from that point of view, you've paid their school fees and you've given them a deposit, which is nice, right? I mean, let's not mock that in any way, shape or form, but it's not the $1.5 million that buys you a home at that point when they take the cash out. It's a deposit towards the home in terms of real purchasing power.
Yeah.
If they put it in the index fund and got 8%, then the net or the after inflation, the real terms purchasing power of that 2.66 million is roughly $500,000 in today's money. So that's a much bigger deposit, but you're still not buying your grandkids a home, right? You've done well, your kids are happy, they've got their school fees paid, maybe the grandkids' school fees paid because it's 20 years, and there has been a nice deposit to share around to pay for university and, to help them out with a deposit on a home, maybe buy them each a car, which is great.
Yeah,
Let's not
absolutely.
sneeze at it, but it's not as powerful as perhaps 2.66 million sounds. Of course, and I'm sure everyone following along at home's worked it out pretty quickly, even with inflation, $18 million is still a huge amount of purchasing power, because that works out as in real terms about 3.5 million. So more than 2 times the real purchasing power that you left in the beginning. Because remember, it's 2 kids, so that's 6 million or 7 million shared between the 2 of them, 3.5 million each. So from that point of view, the strategy of those 3 examples, the term deposit pays the fees, leaves very little in real terms. The market index pays the fees and leaves the beginning of a nest egg. $500,000 is not to be sneezed at.
Absolutely.
In real purchasing terms. And the 15% not only makes them incredibly wealthy on paper and probably pays for more than they could spend, but also ensures that the next generation has more in real terms than you did with each further generation. And I think that's an important point to think about as well. If you want to preserve the living standards or improve them, then you need to not only leave a larger nominal amount, but you need to leave an amount that in purchasing power is greater. It's not just that they bought the same car for a bigger sticker price. It's that they were able to buy a better car, live in a better suburb, send their kids to better schools, have more holidays, have a standard of living that is improved.
Absolutely. So if we think about that, then the majority of parents, grandparents, I'm going to assume go, oh, well, I want to be able to do that third. That third option where, each generation gets better and better.
Yeah, more money in real terms
than
one before, even before they've worked or done anything with their lives.
Exactly.
And of course, that's important because I think the challenge we always forget sometimes when we think about kids is we hope that our children will be successful and that they won't face adversity. But we also know that statistically, one of them within the next generation or 2 is going to have some material challenges, whether that's a disability, whether that's an awful accident, whether it's a bad divorce. There will be something that happens that puts them in a period of adversity. And that's when wealth matters.
Yeah.
Like, let's take away the idea of thinking about this as holidays to Lake Como every year. I mean, maybe that is what they want. But the real reason we leave kids wealth is not so they can have a better holiday or go skiing, on the Black Mountains, right? We're doing it because we want to make sure that if something goes wrong, they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And $1.5 million with $50,000 a year helps, but it doesn't give you protection if something goes materially wrong.
Yeah.
2.5 million left over at the end with 70,000 pulled out gives quite a bit of protection, but it's not a guarantee of living standard. But 15% working out as 18 million, 3.5 million real. That is really, if someone has an awful accident, if someone suffers a young stage cancer or is left disabled in some way or goes through a very messy divorce and has mental health issues that means they're out of the workforce for a decade. That's the kind of money that means nothing is going to change in their living standards and the kids and grandkids and their kids will be okay. So that's really why it matters, I think.
And when we're talking about, that big factor with stress, that changes, the longevity.
10 years on your life, right?
That's huge. And when money's the factor that usually contributes to the stress, it's going to have a significant impact.
Yeah, and I think that's the other way of looking at it, right? We're not only looking at this question through the lens of how do we protect them if something goes wrong, how do we give them better living standards when things go right, but if you could say, I could do something today that helps my kids and grandkids each live on average 10 years longer, I would hope most of us would want to take that for our children. Yeah. And that's really what we're doing here. If that intergenerational wealth is correlated in lots of medical studies with about 10 to 15 years of extra living. That matters, I would hope.
Absolutely it does. And if we look at it, so obviously people are at different stages of their life.
Absolutely.
And when we think about compounding, getting started doing this when you're in your 20s would be ideal. Unfortunately, we can't go back in time, but it's fair to say that at least starting today, as opposed to starting in 2 years' time, from a compounding perspective, is a better option.
Yeah, I think there's 2 lovely analogies there. There's the first, of course, very famous long-term religious one, which is, that idea that someone is sitting in the shade today because someone else planted a tree 10 years ago, right? And we probably all have internalized that through years of education. But the other one, of course, is that lovely old joke of the best time to learn was yesterday, the next best time to learn is today, right? So I think no matter where you are in life, the best time you can start preparing for that next generation assistance is now.
Yeah.
You know, if you've been doing it well before, pat on the back, great work, keep going. But if you haven't, don't wait another 5 years, start now. And talking about what we can do to equip our kids, I think there's a couple of things that we can really do. The first is I think that the school system, whilst it's very good in this country, and I'm a product of a public school, so I will talk it up, does nothing to try and explain how to manage money or wealth. So teach them that. That's only going to come from you.
Yeah.
The second thing is explain compounding. Because intuitively, we as humans are not good at understanding the value of compounding. You know, Warren Buffett makes that lovely quote of, he was asked, why doesn't he drive a fancy car and have a more flashy haircut? And he says, it's very difficult for me to go to the barber because every time I go, it costs me a Ferrari. And it's very hard for me to have a Ferrari because every time I go, it costs me $100 million. Now, he's being facetious, but his point is that if you compound out what he can get over the next, say, 40 years, he's thinking long term, with that money, the cost of the haircut, the cost of the car, the numbers are astronomical. Now, that's obviously he's being facetious. He does get haircuts. He does have a reasonable car, right? But teaching our kids that patience and our grandkids that patience, that idea of delayed gratification, that idea of saving and investing well, will have a material impact on them later in life. In the same way as most of us probably have wealth because it was our patience and delayed gratification that helped us build it.
Yeah.
So, you know, particularly in today's day and age of social media and instant gratification, that's a skill that we really could benefit from teaching our kids. And then the last one really is, I think, in the case of what we can do as finance professionals, the most important, but probably less important than the other two, which is to equip them with the tools to understand what a good investment is and what a bad investment is. Because not only are they likely to, across their life, just as we'd have, come across people selling snake oil, and so the best thing they can do is avoid wasting their money on it, but they're also going to be given opportunities over time to compound wealth much greater than they think. Whether that's the difference between the term deposit and paying off a mortgage, 5% versus 8%, or the idea between putting it in an index fund and managing it themselves, particularly with superannuation. These are challenges that create material long-term value differences, but are often, when we're young, put aside to be dealt with later, because not only do we not confront them, they're not top of mind, but we also don't have the skills. We learn the skills later in life. So if we can teach them that earlier. And so one of the big things we talk about with our Teaminvest members is try and bring your kids and grandkids into the meetings as soon as you can. They may not enjoy all of it. They may not, love it. But every little bit of wisdom that they pick up then that they can apply, whether it's today or in a decade, is going to matter. Particularly if you're leaving them $18 million where they will become the subject of, let's just say, some less ethical searches from other people, right? One always likes to think that your kids' partners are going to be interested in them only for who they are. But if you're leaving 36 million amongst 2 kids, which is the maths we just did, one assumes there may be more than one unethical suitor who turns up, right? So having that kind of knowledge early will protect them in ways that, as well as enhance their life in ways that we probably don't initially consider.
Yeah. And I think that's where even just running scenarios on the compounding calculator that we talked about. So I'd encourage you, jump online, just Google compounding calculator, and it will come up and play with those figures. Play with things like the return, the rate of return, play with things like the period of time, and have a look at the difference. And it's just small amounts that can make a huge difference. Small amounts in the interest rate can make a huge difference in small amounts of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, each extra year is worth more than the year before, and each extra percentage is worth more than the percent before. So from that point of view, anything we can do to equip our kids to live longer, manage their wealth wiser for longer, and get a better return on that wealth without taking stupid risks is going to have a real material effect on our children, and an even bigger, more material effect on our grandkids and their kids and each further generation. Yeah. And so from that point of view, if you really want to give your kids or your grandkids the best shot at life, longer living, more happiness, greater standard of living, other than having good genetics and a good family life, I think the next best thing you can do is teaching them about managing money, because it will have statistically the biggest impact.
Absolutely. And I feel like we're coming kind of to the end of the conversation. Is there anything else that you would like to leave the audience with?
I think we've probably covered it. All I would say is don't shy away from that conversation, about whether it's your own estate planning and what you're going to leave them, or their education. It's difficult sometimes talking to our kids about things like our mortality and our money. They're not easy conversations, but they're a hell of a lot easier to have when you're alive than if you're trying to do it through a will. So from that point of view, just get in front of it early, teach them early, as you would teach them mathematics or reading early, teach them education around wealth early. And then, from your point of view, have those conversations, because if your estate is a reasonable estate, as all of ours will be, almost certainly, the last thing you want to do is have your kids confronting what to do with that when you're not there and they're in grief.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that, from an education perspective, that is one of our main goals at Teaminvest. We want to have the education in place for the next generation. As we're talking about, that's the thing that we can compound, right? And we make education as easy and available as possible. Obviously, we have this podcast that you can subscribe to, family members can subscribe to. We also have the Teaminvest website that you can jump on. We have articles on the Teaminvest website. You can also subscribe to receive regular newsletters that just has some articles, things like that are completely focused around education and providing that education. So look, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. And if I can put one plug in, the best thing you can do by far, in my opinion, is not only be a Teaminvest member, but be a Teaminvest family member. Bring those kids and grandkids to the meetings.
Yeah. And that is, if you become a Teaminvest member, we open it up to your family as well to become members, and as Andrew said, to come along. And as an example of that, we actually have Sanji Narendaran, who most of you will be familiar with, brings his daughter along to a number of the Teaminvest masterclasses.
And she's only, I think, 11, so she's starting early.
She's starting young, so it's never too early. I think once you start to see those figures and what's possible, it suddenly becomes exciting.
Absolutely.
So thank you again for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And as usual, please share it with anyone that you think will find this interesting. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. The information contained in this podcast is of a general nature and is not intended to address the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular individual or entity. It is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute, nor should it be regarded in any manner whatsoever as advice. It is not intended to influence a person in making a decision. No one should act on such information without appropriate professional advice after a thorough examination of their particular situation and needs. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaminvest Wealth Builders. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and inspiring. If you know anyone else who could benefit from hearing this episode, please hit the share button and pass it on. If you'd like to learn more about Teaminvest or our unique investment approach, visit us at teaminvest.com.au. And please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for more episodes. Until next time, stay informed, stay invested, and keep building wealth.